I'm Tanya Walker, and my research is titled Race, Crime, and Socialization. Crime in America has always existed, but I would like to delve into the correlation between race and crime, more specifically African American and crime. The first part of my research will explain how discrimination can be a catalyst in and of itself. The second part of the research will discuss the role parents play in crime and socialization due to cultural and coping strategies. The third part of my research will compare African Americans to white Americans as it relates to crime, treatment, and cultural differences. In this research, we'll look at the aspect of race. African Americans have a different walk in life opposed to white Americans. Discrimination has always been a part of the African American story. According to researchers Burt, Simmons, and Gibbons, 2012, racial discrimination persists and profoundly affects the chances and routine situations of everyday life for racial minorities in the United States. Segregation can also be viewed as a form of discrimination and is very relevant to crime and socialization with African Americans. Shahada and Flynn, 1996, found that social isolation has a negative impact. They expressed that this type of isolation leads to a lack of contact with mainstream institutions necessary for upward social mobility in life. Although it's commonplace for African Americans and other minorities to form communities of just their race due to the safety and comfort they feel in their community. However, consistent with prior research, spatial isolation is positively associated with serious violence and crime by African Americans. Shahada and Flynn, 1996. Residential isolation is a form of segregation and is defined as physical separation between two or more groups. Since the beginning of segregation, residential isolation has been apparent. It started when a black family would move into a white neighborhood. They would get bullied and threatened and sometimes physically harmed. And if they didn't conform and move out, then the whites would start to move out one by one and more blacks would move in, thus creating a decrease in property value. This was unfair and surprisingly common, but is not as prevalent today. The last form of discrimination I want to discuss is intrapersonal racial discrimination. This can be manifested as social distancing and ignoring requests to participate, discrimination at work, school, stereotyping, prejudiced attitudes, and targeting individuals. According to Burt, Simmons, and Gibbons, 2012, recent studies which focus on African Americans point to interpersonal racial discrimination as an important risk factor for offending African Americans, especially males. Next, I would like to discuss the role parents play in race, crime, and socialization. One researcher stated that parents fell into 4 different categories: silence about race, emphasis on cultural socialization, emphasis on cultural socialization and coping strategies, or a balanced approach. McCord, 1991. In the final part of my research, I would like to discuss the differences between African Americans and white Americans in terms of crime, treatment, cultural differences, and the negative social impact. Research indicates that relative to white Americans, African Americans engage in higher street crime. Burt, Simmons, and Gibbons, 2012. As for cultural differences, they are as polar as night and day. For example, African American parents teach their children racism preparation, which consists of defensive and adaptive racial orientation. For instance, a 38-year-old single mother of a 6-year-old boy described telling her son, "You know you're going to be singled out, right? So don't feel bad. You're always going to be singled out because you're black." Cord, Wallace, and Stevenson, Rothman, 2004. In addition to racial preparation, African American parents teach racial pride, racial equality, and racial achievement. As a result of the election and Barack Obama getting elected for president, every African American child, boy or girl, knows that we've had a black American president for the first time in the history of the United States. So this gives them hope that they too can one day possibly be president. In conclusion, race, crime, and socialization are all intertwined. Researchers have been studying these concepts for decades to determine if there is indeed a link between crime, race, and socialization. Certainly there are other factors that lead to criminal behavior, but there's definitely a link between discrimination, race, crime, and socialization. In conclusion, race, crime, and socialization are all intertwined. Researchers have been studying this concept for decades to see if there is indeed a link that connects crime and socialization, crime and discrimination. Certainly, there are other factors that lead to criminal behavior, but enough research has been conducted to show that the elevated rates of criminal behavior in African Americans can lend some of the credit to racial discrimination, whether it's interpersonal or spatial. As Americans, we are all affected by crime, so therefore we should make it our business to understand the ramifications of discrimination, because crime doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter what race you are, you can be a victim of a crime. Continual research is a wonderful tool to help facilitate change, because knowledge is a catalyst for change. Girl, I hope you got what you need, because I'm done. Shit.
Say thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Tanya.
I'm Tanya Walker, Race, Crime, and Socialization. Ding!